A shattered C4 vertebra violently grinds against itself in the pitch-black dirt. Jagged bone splinters scrape through necrotic muscle tissue, forcing a terrifying structural realignment. Unfiltered lunar radiation bypasses collapsed lungs to manually restart a cold heart. Mercy does not wake up. Biology is brutally jump-started by the raw, metallic burn of moonlight piercing the topsoil. Cosmic gravity acts as a terrestrial defibrillator, forcing her rigid chest cavity to expand against 60 pounds of freezing cedar loam, pressing directly against her corneas. Absolute darkness offers zero comfort. Heavy, crushing weight permanently locks her jaw shut. Wet clay packs tightly deep into her nostrils. Suffocating earth seals her bleeding lips together. The intense pressure compresses her ribcage so severely that the first instinctual gasp pulls a solid mass of rotting pine needles straight down her trachea. Oxygen does not exist inside this hole. Panic remains a biological luxury strictly reserved for the living. Instinct drives the dead to move. Her right arm twitches underneath the heavy soil. A thick root rigidly pins her bicep to the packed dirt. Twisting her wrist gains a single inch of physical leverage. Metacarpal bones in her stiff hand crack loudly against an unyielding buried river stone. Scraping becomes her only objective. Fingernails bite deeply into the packed earth situated directly above her ruined face. She drags her hands downward to carefully clear a small pocket of breathing space. Jagged pebbles slice effortlessly through her delicate cuticles. Rough friction feels exactly like dragging her bare skin across rusted steel wool. Ignoring the catastrophic tissue damage completely becomes necessary. Survival demands immediate vertical momentum. Pushing her forearms upward forces her elbows into the narrow dirt walls. Relentless upward clawing tears the keratin completely away from the nail beds. Warm blood mixes instantly with the freezing mud. Digging toward the surface requires ignoring the catastrophic failure of her own digits. Driving with her narrow shoulders, attempts to dislodge the heavy soil pressing against her collarbone. Her newly repaired spine screams in protest as the surrounding earth clinically resists the vertical ascent. Every single millimeter gained costs fresh strips of human skin. The subterranean vault attempts to crush the life back out of her before the pulse can fully take hold. Moonlight acts as a violent chemical catalyst within her heavily irradiated bloodstream. Radiation forcefully burns through the lingering toxins, pooling heavily inside her liver. Torn muscles gorge on sudden, unstable energy derived entirely from the silver light, filtering down through microscopic cracks. She drives her bloody fingers upward once again. Compacted dirt finally gives way to a dense tangle of wet cedar roots. Hooking her bleeding, nailless hands deeply into the wood provides a desperate anchor. With terrifying physical forces, the resurrected tracker pulls her body toward the sky. Her skull breaches the jagged surface of the grave. Freezing December air hits her wet, mud-caked face like shattered glass. Dragging her heavy torso out of the deep sinkhole demands massive effort. She collapses heavily onto the frost-covered moss. Deflated lungs violently inflate with real atmospheric oxygen. This brutal intake sounds exactly like someone tearing thick canvas. Fully expecting the familiar agonizing heat of the shift to begin immediately is a habit formed over decades. Coarse, heavy fur should violently split her soft skin right now. Animalistic fury typically hijacks her fragile human consciousness during a full perigee moon. Nothing happens. The freezing winter wind simply bites deeply into her exposed arms. Intense lunar radiation has permanently burned the lycanthropy completely out of her cellular structure. That terrifying feral beast is officially dead. Only the vulnerable human woman remains lying flat in the dirt. Pressing her bare feet into a shallow puddle of rainwater, she attempts to push herself upright. liquid water instantly flash freezes into jagged solid ice. Transformation is not happening internally anymore. She is unknowingly stripping the ambient heat directly from the surrounding physical air. Stumbling toward a massive rotting pine stump, her internal organs protest the sudden temperature shift. Her stomach violently convulses. Dropping to her knees forces her to dry heave into the sharp briars. Severed vocal cords spasm uncontrollably in her throat. Spitting up a mouthful of toxic mud clears her airway, followed immediately by a small, heavy object. A single blackened silver $50 hits the frozen ground with a dull metallic thud. Harsland Cross tossed that mock ferryman toll onto her chest right before the first heavy shovel of dirt landed. Pure silver is now heavily tarnished from reacting chemically to the lethal dose of wolfsbane still coating the delicate lining of her stomach. It sits quietly in the frost like a forgotten relic. This is exactly how the unyielding algorithm treats unsupported channels on this digital platform. Code buries them deep in the dark dirt and patiently waits for cold indifference to finish the job. If you want to see exactly what Mercy buys with this blackened coin, you must pay the toll. Subscribe and turn on notifications right now to secure your place in the pack. Watch the heavy earth fly. Highly acidic taste lingering stubbornly in the back of her mouth triggers a visceral sensory cascade. Cold mud beneath her freezing knees dissolves instantly into the tactile memory of rough-sawn timber. Absolute darkness of the deep forest is violently replaced by the dim yellow glow of a kerosene lantern swinging from the rafters of the main mess hall. 3 short days ago. Declan Rook stood directly across from her in the sweltering heat of the bunkhouse. His calloused hands trembled so violently the well water sloshed over the rim of a dented tin canteen. "Drink it, Mercy!" He whispered the pathetic command into the quiet room. Dark eyes absolutely refused to meet hers. Just drink it, and he lets you walk away. She easily smelled the bitter chalky undertone of crushed monkshood root actively masking the sharp scent of the water, staring closely at the cowardly man she had willingly shared a bed with. For 3 brutal Pacific Northwest winters revealed everything. His weak jaw was clenched tight with undeniable fear. Securing his own promotion meant paralyzing the only woman who actually understood the deep woods. Heavy rain pounded mercilessly against the thin, rusted tin roof. Sizzling droplets of water leaked through the ceiling to hiss violently against the cast-iron wood stove. Every single sensory detail of that specific moment burned itself permanently into her cerebral cortex. "You poured this." Her voice remained perfectly steady. Anger did not infect her calm tone. "I did what I had to do," he replied without looking up from the wooden floor. Forcefully shoving the heavy tin cup closer to her chest proved his cowardice. "Drink." Mercy took the heavy canteen from his shaking fingers. She swallowed the poisoned water without breaking eye contact. Chemical paralysis hit her lower diaphragm in exactly 4 seconds. The metal cup slipped effortlessly from her suddenly numb grip. It hit the wooden floorboards with a loud, hollow clatter. Her knees completely buckled beneath her shifting weight. Peripheral vision narrowed instantly to a tight gray tunnel as the heavy neurotoxin rapidly severed vital communication between her brain and her motor functions. She collapsed heavily onto her back. Blinking her eyes became completely impossible. Moving her jaw to speak was no longer a biological option. Watching the heavy ceiling beams spin slowly above her head remained her only function. Heavy leather boots crossed the dusty room. Harlan Cross stepped directly into her limited line of sight. The massive logging baron casually carried his double-bitted steel felling axe, resting squarely on his broad shoulder. He did not look at her with burning rage or righteous anger. Looking down with the cold clinical detachment of a bored butcher, evaluating a severely bruised meat carcass was his only expression. You talk too much to the new men." The alpha stated the blunt accusation clearly. He knelt heavily beside her paralyzed form. Suffocating smells of wet dog and sweet chewing tobacco rolled powerfully off his thick wool coat. "You tell them the moon is getting weaker. You tell them I am losing the grip on the pack." She desperately tried to form a single defensive word. Paralyzed vocal cords completely refused to vibrate inside her throat. A silent dog does not start a panic. Harlan delivered the final brutal verdict without hesitation. He pressed the cold, steel edge of the heavy axe blade directly against her pale, vulnerable throat. Applying precise surgical pressure downward, the sharp metal easily parted her soft flesh. Expertly severing her vocal cords with one smooth, terrifying motion guaranteed his secret remained hidden. Ensuring she could not scream when the heavy dirt finally covered her face was his only priority. The final terrible sensation before the dark took over was the crushing, agonizing weight of Harlan, lifting her bleeding body over his massive shoulder like a worthless sack of grain. Mercy blinks rapidly in the present. Violent memories recede back into the recesses of her traumatized brain. Freezing air of the deep timber violently replaces the suffocating smell of the mess hall. She touches her pale neck. A thick, jagged scar sits perfectly sealed beneath her chin. Lunar radiation stitched the torn flesh back together, but deliberately left the rigid knot of scar tissue as a permanent physical record of the betrayal. Tracing the raised skin with a frozen fingertip confirms the horrific reality. Her ability to speak is permanently gone. Communicating her absolute displeasure using the physical environment will have to suffice. 1 mile to the east, the Blackwood timber camp sits in complete ignorant isolation. Heavy bunkhouses are constructed entirely of raw, unpeeled pine logs. Thick black smoke slowly from the iron stovepipes into the starless night sky. The ground forms a churned, frozen wasteland of hardened mud and rusted cross-cut saws. At the far edge of the wide clearing stands the primary meat shed. 6 massive hunting mastiffs are chained directly to thick iron rings, driven deep into the timber walls. These animals are absolutely not ordinary domestic dogs. They are bred specifically for raw violence and tracking speed. Their heavy skulls are incredibly wide and heavily muscled. Thick, coarse coats naturally saturate with heavy oils to aggressively repel the constant freezing winter rain. Sleeping outside in the frozen mud by choice hardens them to the elements. Tracking terrified runaways through the sharp briars without making a single sound until their heavy jaws finally lock onto a bleeding ankle is their only purpose. Heavy iron chains clink softly as the massive beasts pace restlessly. Steam rises continuously from their hot breath. Powerful muscles twitch beneath thick brindle fur. Tonight the dogs are completely awake. They do not bark or growl at the shadows. A sudden invisible anomaly violently strikes the perimeter of the meat shed. Barometric pressure in the immediate 50 feet drops with terrifying unnatural speed. Atmospheric weight plummets at a totally impossible mathematical rate. This sudden invisible vacuum violently compresses the sensitive inner ears of the massive hounds. The lead dog suddenly snaps its heavy head up. Thick black jowls pull back to completely expose yellow canines. Dark blood begins to steadily drip from its wet nose. Severe pressure differentials are aggressively rupturing the delicate capillaries deep inside its sinus cavity. Whining in a high frantic pitch, the dog lunges aggressively forward. Heavy iron links snap totally taut against its thick leather collar. Impact throws the animal violently backward into the frozen dirt. 5 other mastiffs react entirely simultaneously to the atmospheric shift. Excruciating pain in their eardrums completely overrides their brutal physical training. Blind panic takes control of the pack. They do not try to slowly slip their heavy leather collars. Viciously attacking the restraint itself becomes their only logical option. The bleeding lead dog opens its massive jaws and violently bites down on the thick iron links of its own chain. Heavy teeth grind aggressively against the cold, solid metal. A sickening sound of canine enamel, violently cracking against iron, cuts sharply through the freezing air. Blood spills heavily from the dog's mouth as it aggressively chews the unbreakable metal. Iron tears its soft gums to absolute shreds. Remaining dogs immediately follow suit. Thrashing wildly in the mud, they bite ferociously at the chains, holding them securely to the wooden wall. Escape from the localized gravity well actively crushing their thick skulls becomes their only priority. Looking outward toward the dark tree line does not occur to them. Desperation forces them to press their heavy bleeding bodies flat into the dirt to escape the suffocating weight of the sky. Deep in the old-growth timber, Mercy stands perfectly still. Observing her own pale hands brings a cold sense of clarity. Grave dirt caked under her ruined fingernails is completely frozen solid. Tearing pain in her stiff joints has entirely vanished into the night. Her heart beats with a painfully slow, mechanical rhythm. It thumps once every 10 seconds. She is entirely devoid of the frantic, rushing adrenaline that used to define her survival instincts. Aggressive heat that always heavily preceded a violent shift is completely gone. The feral wolf is entirely erased from her blood forever. She is totally hollowed out and filled strictly with the biting, absolute cold of the deep upper atmosphere. Looking upward at the massive Douglas fir towering directly above her provides a target. The ancient tree is easily 10 feet in diameter. It has proudly stood in this isolated valley for over 4 centuries. Incredibly thick bark is deeply furrowed and completely coated in wet green moss. She steps slowly forward toward the massive trunk. Bare feet leave frozen solid impressions in the soft mud. Raising her right hand prepares her to test this new biological reality. She presses her bare palm completely flat against the rough, wet bark. Closing her silver eyes allows her to listen closely to the slow, steady draw of thick sap pulling upward through the massive trunk. The tree operates as a living organism. It generates a very faint, microscopic heat deep within its core. Focusing her newly aligned internal pulse requires zero physical exertion. Commanding the ambient temperature of the wood to completely drop is effortless. The chemical reaction is absolutely instantaneous. Microscopic moisture hovering in the air immediately crystallizes into fine white frost across the back of her cold hand. Temperature inside the thick bark plummets incredibly rapidly. Water molecules trapped deep inside the amber sap completely stop moving. Thermal energy is violently stripped away from the living wood. The internal temperature of the massive hits absolute zero in less than 3 short seconds. Sap violently flash freezes inside the trunk. It expands incredibly forcefully inside the confined vertical chambers of the solid wood. This unnatural process violently reverses the fundamental biological cycle of the old-growth forest. She acts as a walking gravity well for thermodynamics. The ancient tree attempts to draw warmth from the deep subterranean soil to protect its core. Mercy ruthlessly consumes that heat. Frost aggressively crawls up the thick green moss, covering the lower branches. Leaves completely shatter into fine frozen dust as the killing cold reaches the canopy. Massive internal pressure completely shatters the structural integrity of the ancient heartwood. A deafening concussive crack violently fractures the absolute silence of the deep forest. Explosive acoustics perfectly mimic a heavy cannon firing. The massive trunk of the Douglas fir totally splits vertically. A jagged, deep fissure explodes rapidly up the center of the tree for over 30 feet. Thick, heavy slabs of frozen bark buck blow violently outward into the brush. Shards of jagged ice and splintered wood rain down heavily onto the dark forest floor. Lowering her cold, bleeding hand reveals the devastation. Extreme cold radiating from her pale skin naturally stabilizes. She did not use raw physical strength to break the solid timber. Utilizing the fundamental laws of thermodynamics proved far more destructive. Turning her head slowly toward the faint smell of wood smoke, drifting lazily through the high canopy, confirms her path. The psychological siege of Blackwood camp formally begins right now. Declan Rook aggressively pushes the heavy wooden door of the bunkhouse open. Rusted iron hinges squeal loudly in the bitter cold air. Stepping nervously out onto the covered wooden porch, he attempts to catch his breath. Shivering totally uncontrollably beneath his heavy wool coat, he scans the perimeter. Bright lantern light spills out directly behind him to fully illuminate the churned, frozen mud of the main camp square. Rubbing his tired, bloodshot eyes does not erase the deep paranoia clinging to his mind. Stepping down heavily into the dirt, he prepares to relieve himself in the dark. He walks slowly toward the very edge of the wide clearing. Freezing bitter wind bites sharply at his exposed face. Shadows stretch and distort unnaturally in the freezing fog. The suffocating silence of the ancient trees makes his skin crawl. He always feels as though the forest itself meticulously counts his every breath. Nervously unbuttoning his trousers near the large, flat execution stump, heavily used for splitting firewood, he glances around the quiet yard. Yellow light from the cabin barely reaches this far out into the deep shadows. Declan casually looks down at the stump. He instantly stops breathing. Sitting perfectly upright in the dead absolute center of the bloody wood is a familiar object. It is a heavily dented tin canteen. He takes a very slow, unsteady step forward. Immediate recognition of the heavy, deep dent located near the bottom rim strikes him. Seeing the heavily frayed canvas strap wrapped tightly around the narrow neck sends a shockwave of pure terror down his spine. This is the exact same canteen he personally used to poison Mercy 3 nights ago. That identical metal container he watched fall heavily from her paralyzed fingers directly into the sawdust is now sitting on the chopping block. The canteen is absolutely not empty. Dull metal surfaces are heavily coated in an incredibly thick layer of impossible bright blue frost. Reaching out slowly with a violently trembling hand, he hesitates. Raw fingertips lightly brush the frozen metal. Extreme cold instantly burns his sensitive skin like an open flame. Jerking his hand back rapidly, he stumbles backward. Thick frost covering the canteen is incredibly dense and completely unnatural. Water inside the tin is totally frozen solid. Frantically looking up from the blood-stained stumps yields no answers. Staring deeply into the impenetrable black wall of the deep timber only offers terrifying silence. Tall ancient trees provide absolutely nothing but deep shadows. Surrounding darkness is totally complete and deeply suffocating. Dead women absolutely do not return their cups, which means the rotting thing they buried deeply in the dirt is currently watching him breathe. Declan cannot move his heavy boots. Impossible blue frost, creeping up the dented metal sides of the tin canteen, completely paralyzes his motor functions. He stands exposed in the freezing mud beside the blood-stained chopping block. Waiting for a massive shadow to detach itself from the dark tree line feels entirely logical. Razor-sharp teeth should puncture his carotid artery from the blind side right now. Neither consequence materializes. The surrounding old-growth timber remains utterly motionless. Only the biting wind moves, dragging the sharp scent of crushed pine needles across the compound. A deafening structural shriek of half-inch cast iron failing violently fractures the early morning silence. Exactly 50 yards across the frozen Blackwood camp, The primary industrial steam boiler powering the heavy mechanical logging winches encounters a catastrophic physical anomaly. 2 human stokers fired the massive cylindrical furnace over an hour ago. Internal temperatures currently sit firmly above 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Highly pressurized steam normally drives the heavy braided steel cables required to drag massive felled timber through the deep winter mud. That predictable industrial process abruptly terminates. Deep inside the sealed metal jacket, the localized atmospheric pressure mathematically plummets to absolute zero in less than 3 seconds. Thermodynamics fundamentally invert. Microscopic kinetic energy, actively keeping the water boiling, is violently stripped from the confined environment. Superheated liquid flash freezes entirely from the inside out. Water rapidly expanding into dense solid ice inside a sealed iron container creates an unstoppable internal kinetic force. The thick metal casing bulges outward. Deep structural fissures instantly form along the heavy iron rivets lining the main seam. The metal actively groans under the impossible strain, screaming like a dying animal before the structural integrity completely fails. The boiler detonates. It does not produce a fiery visual explosion, generating a devastating concussive shock wave of expanding unnatural ice and tearing jagged metal alters the landscape instantly. Hundreds of heavy iron shrapnel shards aggressively shred the freezing morning fog. Large chunks of twisted metal slice cleanly through the wooden walls of the nearby mess hall with zero mechanical resistance. 2 human stokers standing directly adjacent to the machine are instantly pulverized into a fine red mist by the localized pressure blast. Blood immediately freezes against the scattered ice blocks. Agonized screams immediately erupt from the surrounding wooden bunkhouses. Inside his locked private quarters, the Alpha ignores the explosive chaos ringing across his territory. Harlan Cross sits rigidly on the edge of his unmade cot, holding his massive hands up to the weak gray light filtering through the dirty glass window reveals a stark reality. The clinical manifestation of his failing internal biology is terrifying. Thick yellowed keratin claws that typically retract seamlessly into his nail beds are severely cracked. They appear highly brittle, resembling dead birch bark. Black lines of necrotic tissue trace the veins beneath his pale skin. Pressing his heavy thumb against his forefinger, attempts to force a partial biological shift. He expects the sharp, lethal hook to smoothly puncture his own skin. Instead, the pressure causes a dry, sickening snap. Half of his index claw simply flakes away. Dead tissue falls onto the dusty floorboards. The sound of his own failing anatomy is louder than the screams echoing outside. Running a heavily calloused tongue over his front teeth brings the sharp, metallic taste of old blood. Black, necrotic bile steadily leaks from his receding upper gums. His biological connection to the ancient lunar cycle is actively dying. Lycanthropy requires immense cellular regeneration. It demands a constant influx of cosmic radiation to safely manage the violent tearing and rebuilding of bone density required for the physical transformation. The moon has formally withdrawn its power. Internal cells are actively rejecting the process. Major organs are slowly necrotizing, while he remains entirely conscious. He is rotting from the inside out. Terrified of the younger pack members detecting this fatal decay, he grabs a rusted tin of toxic pine tar from the nightstand, rubbing the thick, pungent black sludge over his neck and wrists chemically masks the scent of his own dying tissue. The sharp, burning smell of the tar briefly overwhelms the sickly sweet odor of gangrene settling into his joints. Screaming from the muddy yard demands immediate attention. Showing physical weakness inside a lawless camp guarantees a bloody death sentence. He grabs his heavy wool coat off the wooden chair. Booted feet step out into the freezing mud. Panicked men run wildly around the destroyed steam engine. Twisted iron steams against the packed frost. A young human logger, his face severely lacerated by flying glass, falls to his knees near the mess hall steps. Crimson drops stain the white ground beneath him. The machine just froze, the young man shrieks hysterically. Pointing a shaking, bloody finger toward the dark timber, directs attention to the deep woods. The fire turned into solid ice. The woods are coming back for us. Harlan steps forward. He offers no verbal reassurance to the terrified logging crew, requiring an immediate physical demonstration of brutal authority to silence. The panic remains his only objective. The pack responds only to raw displays of kinetic violence. Grabbing the young logger by the thick canvas collar of his jacket happens incredibly fast. Harlan lifts the terrified man completely off his feet with one arm, suspending him over the frozen dirt. The boy's heavy work boots kick uselessly at the cold air. Panic is an infection. Harlan states the fact with a cold, flat delivery. He pulls his massive right arm back, coiling the thick muscles of his shoulder tight against the fabric of his coat. Driving his closed fist directly into the center of the logger's face produces a wet, heavy thud. The physical impact sounds exactly like a heavy iron mallet striking a wet melon. Nasal cartilage shatters instantly, driving microscopic bone splinters directly into the delicate brain cavity. Orbital bones fracture forcefully into dozens of jagged shards. Harlan does not drop the limp body immediately. He delivers a second brutal horizontal strike directly to the man's unprotected throat. The delicate windpipe crushes completely flat under the massive, blunt force. Carelessly tossing the twitching, lifeless body into the frozen mud sends a clear, mathematical message regarding hierarchy. Clean that garbage up. Harlan commands the silent, staring crowd. He points his bloody knuckles toward the lead hound Hallard standing near the meat shed. Soren, get the tracking dogs. Hunt whatever hit my machine and bring me its head. Soren sprints toward the heavy wooden doors of the kennels. Carrying a thick coil of heavy braided leather leads slung over his shoulder, he prepares for the violent chase. He entirely expects the massive mastiffs to be howling for blood, reacting aggressively to the loud explosion. Instead, he finds them completely flattened against the frozen dirt inside their pens. The heavy stench of canine fear saturates the freezing air. Heavy iron chains securing them to the wooden walls are severely chewed and permanently warped. The lead dog's mouth is a ruined, bleeding mess of broken white enamel and shredded pink gums. Drool mixed with bright red blood pools on the frost beneath its wide jaw. Violently kicking the lead dog squarely in the ribs fails to elicit a defensive response. Up on your feet! Screaming the command directly into the animal's bleeding ear produces nothing but a pitiful whine. Soren hooks a heavy brass carabiner directly to the dog's thick spiked leather collar. Dragging the massive animal out into the freezing air requires extreme physical effort. He pulls it directly toward the dark tree line bordering the destroyed boiler. The dog physically resists with massive force. Locking its heavy joints completely drops its center of gravity. Thick, heavy paws tear deep parallel gouges into the frozen mud bed as Soren forcefully drags it forward by the neck. Approaching the dark edge of the old-growth timber, the ambient temperature drops significantly. An atmospheric anomaly lingering directly in the trees is completely invisible, but mathematically precise. Canine olfactory systems rely heavily on intricate internal nasal cavities, highly sensitive to severe barometric shifts. Dragging the heavy dog exactly 10 feet from the first massive pine tree triggers a violent biological reaction. The localized air pressure plummets. This invisible vacuum violently extracts the physical oxygen directly from the dog's lungs. Microscopic blood vessels lining the animal's highly sensitive sinus cavity rupture completely, Thick dark blood immediately begins pouring continuously from the mastiff's wet nose. The animal does not growl. It emits a high panicked whistling sound through its ruined teeth. Dropping its heavy belly entirely flat against the slick ice prevents further forced forward movement. Wrapping the leather lead tightly around his right wrist, Soren leans backward to apply maximum mechanical leverage. He fully intends to choke the dog into forward submission. "Move forward, you worthless cur!" Realizing the invisible barrier ahead is mathematically fatal happens instantly within the animal's mind. Moving forward equals immediate biological death. The canine brain calculates the environmental threat with terrifying speed. That angry human holding the leash is significantly less dangerous than the crushing atmospheric vacuum waiting deep in the dark trees. The mastiff whips its heavy skull around. Completely ignoring the metal chain cutting deeply into its throat, massive jaws clamp directly down onto Soren's right forearm. Heavy yellow canine teeth effortlessly puncture the thick canvas sleeve. They sink deeply into the dense human muscle tissue. The dog violently thrashes its heavy head forcefully from side to side. It completely severs the ulnar artery with one brutal tearing motion. Flexor tendons snap audibly beneath the pale skin. Soren screams loudly in pure agonizing pain, his voice piercing the cold morning fog. Dropping the thick leather lead immediately saves his arm from being entirely detached. The dog releases its bloody grip. Frantically scrambling away, it flees violently back toward the perceived safety of the main camp square. Soren collapses heavily into the mud. Desperately gripping his ruined geysering arm, he is completely unable to stop the rapid arterial blood loss, staining the white frost bright crimson. Declan Rook witnesses the brutal mauling from the safety of the dark bunkhouse porch. Sickness twists violently in his empty gut. Pushing aggressively back through the heavy wooden doors removes him from the freezing air. Surviving pack members are huddled closely inside the dimly lit room. Paranoia heavily saturates the confined space. Men frantically check their rifle actions. Loading heavy silver slag rounds into double-barreled shotguns occupies their trembling, dirt-stained hands. The metallic click of closing breechages echoes rapidly. Stumbling toward his wooden footlocker resting at the foot of his narrow cot, Declan throws open the heavy lid. Frantically tearing through folded gray wool blankets, retrieves a rolled canvas map of the Blackwood timber claims. He slams the heavily creased parchment down onto the central wooden dining table. Dust motes dance in the weak light filtering through the window. Look closely at the topographical lines. Ordering the men forces his voice to crack severely under the extreme psychological strain. 3 heavily muscled loggers step forward slowly. They stare silently down at the sprawling map of the logging sections. Red ink clearly marks the current camp. Black geometric lines denote the heavy timber routes. Pressing a shaking dirt-stained finger directly onto the location of the destroyed steam engine establishes a starting point. Declan deliberately traces a slow line outward toward the deep eastern ridge. The boiler explosion. He speaks rapidly, cold sweat actively beating on his forehead despite the freezing draft in the room. The frozen sap exploding the deep trees yesterday. The exact spot where the dogs went insane. It mathematically aligns with Sector 4. Soren's older brother, a massive brute named Kincaid, narrows his dark eyes suspiciously. So what? Kincaid demands aggressively, shifting the weight of his weapon. It is just a topographical ridge. Anyone could walk it. It is not just a ridge. It is her exact timber cruising route. Declan replies, completely unable to stop his hands from trembling against the canvas. The heavy silence in the room deepens. Mercy meticulously mapped that exact line 3 years ago. She knows every single physical blind spot. She understands every topographical dip in the valley. She is systematically walking her own path backward directly into the camp. She is utilizing the geometry of the forest against us. Total silence envelops the massive men. Kincaid steps closer, slowly dropping the heavy barrel of his shotgun directly toward the floorboards. Mercy is dead in the dirt. Kincaid states the fact clinically. Harlan cut her throat cleanly. We buried her deep under 60 pounds of wet clay. Violently shaking his head, Declan forcefully wipes heavy sweat from his terrified eyes. The crushing weight of his own survival instincts finally shatters his fragile loyalty. I personally ground the monk's root. Confessing loudly hangs the terrible words heavily in the freezing room, fundamentally altering the reality of the surrounding men. I slipped the toxic wolfsbane directly into her canteen. Handing the tin cup to her ensured Harlan could execute her completely without a physical fight, because she was actively going to expose his sickness. She was the absolute best tracker this camp ever produced. Suppressing her feral strength allowed her to live quietly among us. She was the apex predator of this entire valley, and we threw her in a wet hole. Surviving pack members stare at him with creeping horror. Fully understanding the immediate, terrifying tactical disadvantage takes only seconds. Mercy was never just a disposable human laborer. She was the highly trained weapon they deliberately relied upon to safely navigate the hostile territory. They brutally murdered their deadliest strategic asset. Now, that identical weapon actively utilizes her intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain to systematically dismantle their defenses. She isn't indiscriminately attacking the wooden camp. Clinically hunting the specific coward who carefully poured the poison remains her singular focus. Heavy leather boots violently kick the thick bunkhouse doors completely off their iron hinges. Splintered wood flies forcefully inward, striking the hard dirt floor. Harlan Cross entirely fills the massive doorframe. The Alpha's heavy face is severely contorted with pure violent rage. Blood heavily stains his knuckles from the murdered logger. Hearing the entire panicked confession directly through the thin pine walls confirmed his worst fears. Mutiny actively spreads like a localized biological infection. Stepping aggressively into the room demands absolute silence. "You dare speak her name to my pack?" Roaring the question, Harlan violently grabs Declan entirely by the throat and slams him forcefully against the heavy log wall. The impact knocks the remaining breath from Declan's lungs. "She is systematically hunting us." Declan chokes out painfully, kicking his heavy boots desperately against the air. "I am the absolute only thing you hunt for." Screaming directly into Declan's terrified face, Harlan drops the smaller man forcefully to the wooden floor. The Alpha turns aggressively to face the terrified pack. Requiring an immediate display of raw biological power to completely crush the rebellion is his only logical next step. Planting his heavy boots squarely on the wooden planks, he closes his eyes tightly. He violently attempts to force his body to undergo the brutal shift into a massive timber wolf. Violently flexing his heavy shoulders, he internally demands his skeletal structure to break and aggressively realign. Thick, dark veins bulge heavily against his thick neck. Desperately waiting for the familiar agonizing heat of the transition to flood his bloodstream yields nothing. The expected rush of feral adrenaline never arrives. The biological shift entirely fails to materialize. Dying cells absolutely refuse to cooperate. The lunar connection is completely severed. Before the first coarse bristle of heavy fur can push forcefully through his sweating pores, the surrounding atmosphere violently alters. Mercy initiates the next calculated phase of her psychological siege directly from the dark tree line. Targeting the precise geometric coordinates of the heavy bunkhouse requires zero physical effort. Standing miles away in the freezing shadows, she anchors her bare boots deeply in the frozen dirt. Forcefully manipulating the atmospheric weight of the targeted enclosed space becomes a purely mathematical exercise. She visualizes the air pressure inside the cabin and forcefully pulls it outward. Barometric pressure inside the cabin completely plummets with devastating, unnatural speed. It absolutely does not happen slowly. The transition is extremely violent and totally immediate. Physical air aggressively extracts directly out of the sealed room, rushing through microscopic cracks in the timber walls. 8 heavy kerosene lanterns hanging securely from the ceiling beams react instantly to the localized pressure vacuum. Internal pressure trapped directly inside the thin glass bulbs is suddenly vastly higher than the newly created vacuum in the room. They absolutely do not explode outward. Glass chimneys violently implode simultaneously inward. The sharp, shattering implosion sounds exactly like stepping forcefully onto a pile of dry, fragile light bulbs. Jagged glass fragments fly aggressively inward. Burning liquid kerosene is instantly snuffed out by the total complete absence of atmospheric oxygen. The fuel simply cannot sustain a chemical reaction. Plunging the entire enclosed room into absolute darkness happens in less than a single microsecond. Human eardrums completely fail to equalize the sudden catastrophic pressure difference. Kincaid screams loudly, dropping heavily to his knees. Thick, warm blood suddenly ruptures directly from his right ear canal, dripping steadily onto the rough planks. Intense vacuum pressure violently crushes their internal equilibrium. Every single man inside the dark bunk house collapses heavily onto the wooden floorboards, forcefully gripping their bleeding heads in agonizing physical pain. The air is so thin that drawing a breath burns their tracheas like inhaled fire. Staggering violently backward into the doorframe, Harlan grabs his chest. The unnatural vacuum severely compresses his rigid chest cavity. Drawing a single breath of physical air is impossible. The Alpha is entirely suffocating inside his own constructed stronghold. Aggressively beating his heavy chest with bloody fists, he violently fights a totally invisible mathematical enemy. His massive lungs painfully contract against his ribs. Driven entirely mad by the sheer clinical precision of the unseen attack, Harlan blindly kicks his way rapidly back through the shattered wooden doorway. Violently throwing his massive body out onto the frozen mud of the open camp square finally allows dense, freezing air to enter his starving lungs. Atmospheric pressure immediately normalizes outside the cabin structure. Gasping aggressively for cold, biting air, he drops heavily to his hands and knees. His eyes are completely bloodshot. Heavy dark veins aggressively web across his white sclera from the severe biological pressure change. Furiously forcing his heavily failing body to stand entirely upright, he glares at the surrounding trees. Staring aggressively out into the pitch-black woods surrounding his decaying isolated empire, Harlan raises his heavy bloody fists high into the freezing air. Unleashing a deafening, blood-curdling roar, entirely composed of raw, feral desperation, echoes across the quiet valley. "Show yourself to me." Screaming violently into the dark timber is the absolute only tactical move he has left. Fight me with physical flesh and bone. Come completely out of the dirt. Aggressively demanding a traditional physical war of attrition proves his absolute ignorance. He violently challenges a silent ghost to a bloody melee, completely unaware of the terrifying mathematical reality actively closing in around his perimeter. His enemy absolutely no longer needs to physically touch him to tear his entire world completely apart. She owns the air he breathes. Harlan stands bleeding from the eyes, roaring his blind challenge directly into the freezing void, desperately demanding a physical fight with a woman who effortlessly controls the very air he is currently begging to breathe. Before she steps out of that tree line to answer him, I want to know exactly where you are watching this psychological siege from. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. If you want to survive the final atmospheric drop when she answers his roar, you need to secure your place in the pack. Hit that like button. Share this hunt with a friend, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell immediately before the pressure inside your own room violently plummets. A violent, localized vacuum physically rips the atmospheric oxygen straight from the churned dirt of the wide logging clearing. Harlan Cross stands with his heavy jaw completely unhinged to deliver a deafening feral challenge into the dark timber. That aggressive sound abruptly dies deep inside his raw throat. Sound waves mathematically require a gaseous medium to travel across open space, and the resurrected tracker has ruthlessly subtracted that essential condition from the immediate environment. Crushing absolute stillness slams downward onto the Blackwood camp exactly like a solid iron vault door sealing shut. The relentless biting winter wind abruptly ceases its aggressive assault on the wooden structures. Dropping barometric pressure violently severs the natural meteorological currents sweeping down from the jagged mountain ridges. Suspended dirt particles hang entirely motionless in the freezing fog. Every single microscopic droplet of moisture hovering near the timberline instantly crystallizes into jagged floating ice. Z's suspended shards refuse to fall, caught perfectly in the terrifying zero-gravity suspension of her atmospheric manipulation. Total physical absence of air pressure creates profound physiological panic. The sudden atmospheric alteration acts as a terrestrial chokehold. Surviving loggers frantically clutch their heavy wool coats as their rigid chests violently compress inward. Lungs aggressively squeeze against ribs, desperate to extract physical air from a space completely devoid of it. Blood vessels lining their sensitive ocular cavities expand rapidly under the severe internal pressure. Men drop heavily to their bruised knees in the freezing mud. Starved tracheas burn agonizingly as they forcefully attempt to inhale pure invisible void. The alpha stands violently frozen mid-scream, heavily gasping for a physical element that no longer surrounds his face. Blood aggressively pulses against his thick eardrums. Internal pressure actively threatens to rupture delicate tympanic membranes. His vision blurs into a heavily distorted gray haze. Driven entirely mad by the sheer clinical precision of this psychological torture, Harlan absolutely refuses to accept tactical defeat. Violently shoving his massive weight forward through the dead air requires extreme physical exertion. He aggressively grabs Soren by his torn canvas collar. Hauling the bleeding hound Heller forcefully upright, the massive Baron violently drags him toward the exact center of the open compound. Angrily gesturing for the remaining terrified men to follow immediately initiates the final stand. Survival actively demands absolute obedience to the reigning dominant beast, even when invisible thermodynamic forces systematically dismantle their wooden defenses. Staggering blindly into the open frost unites the remaining pack. Hot crimson liquid continuously drips from their ruptured ears. Boots scrape heavily against the hardened ground without producing a single decibel of noise. Complete acoustic vacuum makes the brutal physical struggle look entirely like a macabre's silent theater production. Standing rigidly shoulder to shoulder, the broken pack prepares for a visceral bloodbath. Harlan forcefully demands the biological shift by aggressively beating his own heavy chest. Agonizing physical transformations begin immediately beneath the starless December sky. This specific process entirely lacks grace or natural fluidity. It is a violent anatomical rebellion against the fragile human form. Human skeletal structures violently fracture directly beneath pale, sweating skin. Collarbones snap forcefully upward to completely reconfigure the upper thoracic cavity. Jawbones forcibly dislocate with sickening internal pressure, aggressively elongating into massive, heavy canine snouts. Thick, coarse brindle fur pushes brutally through rapidly tearing dermal layers. Every single hair follicle erupts in an agonizing display of accelerated cellular growth. Hot, dark blood mixes heavily with steaming saliva as the loggers drop forcefully onto all four limbs. Newly formed, heavy paws tear deeply into the hardened frost. Fingernails forcefully eject from their bloody nail beds to make way for lethal, dark keratin talons. Heavy, dense muscle fibers rapidly weave themselves around lengthening femurs. Sickening structural realignments generate massive amounts of internal heat. Harlan actively taps into his rapidly decaying cellular structure, desperately forcing his dying biology to consume its final microscopic reserves of lingering lunar energy heavily strains his heart. The resulting physical mutation is completely grotesque. His massive timber wolf shape manifests severely asymmetrical and deeply unnatural. Large patches of necrotic gray flesh entirely lack protective fur. Sharp, splintered bone actively protrudes through the rotting tissue lining his right shoulder joint. The failing biological transition completely refuses to heal severe internal damage. Black bile constantly drips from his misshapen jaws, sizzling faintly exactly where it hits the frozen mud. Standing aggressively at the front of the pack, a rotting king leads a terrified vanguard of pure, dense muscle. Hot steam violently rolls off their heavily expanded bodies in thick, dense clouds. Every exhale acts like a heavy industrial smokestack venting directly into the freezing night. The sheer atmospheric suppression actively fights their supernatural biology. A freak December whiteout abruptly drops from the pitch-black sky. Millions of heavy, jagged snowflakes fall completely vertically into the clearing. The unnatural storm rapidly intensifies, severely cutting visual visibility down to mere inches. Temperatures plummet precipitously into the negative double digits. Thick white snow instantly begins burying the bloody mud and discarded iron machinery scattered across the yard. Heavy cast iron boiler debris vanishes beneath the relentless icy accumulation. Heavily muscled wolves pace aggressively in a tight defensive circle, snapping their massive jaws frantically at the freezing flakes. Expecting a terrifying apex beast to charge violently from the deep shadows keeps their adrenal glands fully saturated. Kinetic energy aggressively hums through tightly coiled hind legs. The pack fully expects a bloody collision of fangs and tearing claws. The unnatural blizzard abruptly parts. A perfectly clear geometric corridor aggressively slices directly through the falling snow. Swirling flakes of heavy ice violently separate exactly down the center line of the main logging road. Invisible atmospheric plows completely push the weather system aside. Mercy finally steps out of the old-growth timber. Remaining entirely barefoot, actively exposes her skin to the bitter frost. Her torn burial dress is completely caked in hardened black clay from the deep sinkhole. Razor-sharp ice actively crunches heavily beneath her pale toes. Being completely unfazed by the lethal ambient cold, dropping 30 degrees below freezing, proves her newly altered physiology. The freezing wind violently whips her dark tangled hair across her heavily scarred neck. Carrying a physical weapon of any kind is entirely unnecessary. Raising empty hands to adopt a defensive posture does not occur to her. Calculated posture projects total mathematical dominance over the surrounding elements. She walks with slow, deliberate, mechanical precision. Ice melts and flash freezes into dark solid glass directly beneath her bare soles. The massive wolves freeze in place, completely unsure how to mathematically attack a target that clearly projects zero biological heat. Harlan locks his bloodshot yellow eyes directly onto her fragile human silhouette. Seeing his murdered victim standing completely exposed, triggers a violent surge of raw feral instinct. The alpha entirely expects a remarkably easy kinetic kill. Gathering his massive, misshapen hind legs beneath his rotting, heavy torso, he completely ignores his failing biology. Arrogance totally blinds his tactical reasoning. Aggressively lunging forward with terrifying physical speed, bridges the gap instantly. Over 400 pounds of mutated bone and dense muscle launch violently through the freezing air. His heavy, clawed feet completely clear the frozen ground. Gaping, heavily fanged jaws aim flawlessly for her exposed pale throat. He fully anticipates the hot metallic taste of her arterial blood washing over his thick tongue. Violently severing her cervical vertebrae with one brutal lateral bite consumes his predatory thoughts. Mercy absolutely does not flinch. Stepping backward is a tactical concept she permanently abandoned under 60 pounds of wet topsoil. Solidly anchoring her bare, muddy boots deeply into the frozen ground establishes a rigid foundation. Raising her chin slightly, she clinically calculates the exact physical trajectory of the massive beast flying directly toward her face. Tracking his parabolic arc perfectly provides the necessary mathematical coordinates, tapping instantly into the massive, intense lunar radiation. Actively humming through her cold veins requires exactly 0 physical exertion. She fundamentally alters the atmospheric pressure within a precise 10-foot radius directly in front of her. A localized gravity well aggressively forms directly in Harlan's exact flight path. The crushing physical weight of the sudden atmospheric change hits the airborne wolf like a solid cast iron pillar. This specific manipulation is absolutely not a simple vacuum. It constitutes a catastrophic biological inversion. Extreme barometric pressure violently forces the massive canine skeletal structure to instantly regress completely against its own structural will. Ancient lunar biology specifically requires highly normalized atmospheric conditions to successfully maintain the massive physical mass of the lycanthropic beast. Actively stripping those precise conditions forcefully causes his body to instantly rebel against the unnatural transformation. Harlan emits a horrific gurgling shriek mid-air. Heavy lupine femurs aggressively pop backward out of their expanded sockets with deafening cracks. Thick, coarse fur forcefully detaches from rapidly shrinking pores, blowing away into the violent blizzard exactly like dead gray ash. Elongated jawbones violently snap back into a flat human skull with a sickening, bone-shattering sound. Dense feral muscle mass rapidly liquefies and aggressively compresses back into weak human tissue. The terrifying alpha timber wolf is entirely stripped away in less than 1 mathematical second. Forced biological contraction completely shreds his internal organs. Gravity forcefully claims the remaining biological mass. A weak, completely naked, profusely bleeding human man slams violently face-first into the unforgiving jagged ice. Harlan completely shatters his fragile nasal cavity upon heavy impact. Hot, dark blood violently explodes across the pristine white snow. He is entirely stripped of his supernatural dominance and physical superiority. Severe friction tears long strips of pale soft skin directly from his unprotected chest as he violently skids forward. Brutal deceleration actively dislocates his left shoulder entirely from the rotator cuff, coming to a brutal sudden physical stop. Exactly 3 short feet from the dark hem of her mud-caked dress ends his desperate flight. Coughing up thick ropes of black necrotic bile, he desperately attempts to drag his broken human body away from the terrifying cold anomaly. His heavily calloused fingers frantically claw at the frozen mud. Tearing his remaining fingernails entirely off on the jagged ice leaves bright crimson stains. Deep red smears strictly document his pathetic crawling retreat. Shivering uncontrollably in the sub-zero temperatures, The completely deposed leader looks utterly pathetic. Trying aggressively to push his heavy torso entirely upright yields absolutely zero result. The muscular supernatural strength he used to rule the isolated valley is permanently gone forever. Only the fragile, terrified dying human remains shivering on the cold dirt. Remaining wolves immediately drop their heavy bellies entirely flat against the snow, whining pitifully as they forcefully submit to the superior thermodynamic mathematics of the environment, seals their immediate surrender. Their feral brains fully recognize that physical attacks are completely useless against a walking weather system. They press their wet snouts deeply into the frost, completely avoiding all eye contact. Mercy steps slowly forward, approaching his crawling form with chilling mechanical precision, takes only 3 paces. Bare frozen feet make absolutely zero sound against the hardened earth. Stepping effortlessly over the completely paralyzed form of Kincaid demonstrates her absolute disregard for the cowering pack. She stands directly over Harlan's violently shaking bare back. Looking down reveals absolute pathetic weakness, completely devoid of any former glory. Vocal cords permanently severed by his own steel axe ensure her complete absolute silence. Justice requires direct physical action, not wasted breath or emotional monologues. Pity does not exist strictly within her heavily irradiated frozen biology. She carefully places the bare, frost-hardened heel of her left boot directly onto his lower spine, targeting the exact critical junction of the fragile lumbar vertebrae requires highly intimate, deep anatomical knowledge. Understanding exactly where the human frame supports the most physical weight informs her exact angle. She establishes the precise physical contact point directly on his L4 vertebra. The specific pivot point connecting the torso to the lower extremities acts as the ultimate structural weakness. She absolutely does not aggressively stomp downward with blind, raging anger. Applying targeted mechanical leverage takes only a fractional shift in her physical posture. She solidly presses downward directly against the thick bone. Human skeletal structures, heavily weakened by the violent biological inversion, offer zero mechanical resistance. She slowly applies her entire physical body weight heavily downward. Extreme pressure steadily mounts against the thick, pale human bone, shifting her entire mass directly onto that single microscopic fulcrum, permanently isolates the specific fragile vertebrae. Harlan lets out a completely pathetic, wet, gurgling wheeze directly into the cold, wet mud. He completely lacks the heavy mechanical muscular strength to physically throw her entirely off his ruined spine. The heavy, thick bone actively bows deeply under the precise, localized downward weight. His central lumbar vertebrae completely shatter aggressively into dozens of sharp, jagged fragments. The sickening, incredibly heavy, loud crunch violently echoes sharply across the dead, silent clearing. Severed central nervous pathways instantly misfire and catastrophically fail. Extreme physical paralysis rapidly races down his heavy legs. Harlan entirely loses all motor function completely below his rib cage. Screaming agonizingly into the falling snow provides his only release. Completely useless limbs instantly become permanent dead weight, dragging helplessly behind his torso. The crippling, horrific injury flawlessly mirrors the exact physical helplessness he previously forced upon her, right before the heavy dirt covered her pale face. He is forever trapped in a failing human shell, securely pinned to the freezing mud. Blood heavily pools directly beneath his completely destroyed lower back. Mercy slowly removes her muddy boot from his broken spine. Turning her head toward the dark, shattered bunkhouse porch, reveals the last loose end. Declan Rook actively kneels in the freezing dirt beside the wooden steps. Weeping heavily in pure, unadulterated terror consumes him entirely. He tightly clutches his thin coat, violently waiting for the killing blow he absolutely knows he mathematically deserves. Hot tears actively freeze directly against his pale, shaking cheeks. Dirty hands are tightly clasped directly together in a highly pathetic, weak physical display of desperate begging. Trembling lips completely fail to formulate a single coherent plea for his pathetic life. He fully expects her to aggressively crush his skull with the identical brutal leverage. Walking deliberately past his trembling form finalizes her silent judgment. Leaving the treacherous coward completely physically untouched serves as the ultimate brutal punishment. Death is a biological mercy she absolutely refuses to grant him. Condemning him to live as a paralyzed, entirely powerless witness to this new terrifying hierarchy is her absolute decree. Every time the winter wind drops, he will strictly remember exactly who controls the atmospheric weight of the valley, painstakingly surviving every single freezing day entirely burdened by the horrific memory of her cold silver eyes becomes his new terrifying reality. He will never again walk into the deep timber without violently looking strictly over his own shoulder. His sanity is permanently shattered by the absolute mathematical reality of her return. Stopping briefly near the shattered wooden doorway, she casually bends down. Pale fingers completely grasp the thick collar of Harlan's discarded heavy fur coat lying abandoned on the boards. Lifting the massive garment effortlessly proves her enhanced kinetic strength. Tossing the thick wool carelessly out into the freezing wind actively leaves the alpha entirely exposed to the lethal elements. The dark coat vanishes rapidly into the blinding whiteout, landing deep in a snowy ravine. A brutal winter freeze will completely slowly finish the highly violent job. Harlan mathematically will freeze to death long before the sun finally rises over the jagged eastern ridge. Hypothermia guarantees a slow, excruciatingly painful conclusion to his brutal reign. Mercy turns her scarred back on the ruined camp forever. Walking deliberately toward the impenetrable black timber embraces the dark. Ancient massive trees silently part to grant her absolute passage. The storm rapidly intensifies directly behind her, aggressively covering bare footprints with fresh, heavy ice. Disappearing entirely into the deep old-growth woods, she reclaims absolute autonomy as the nameless sovereign of the isolated valley. Looking back at the shattered empire she systematically dismantled never crosses her mind. A wide detached mental pan sweeps slowly over the pristine snow-buried Blackwood logging claim. White drifts violently consume the shattered wooden buildings, the frozen broken machinery, and the shivering paralyzed bodies lying helplessly in the dirt. Absolute silence heavily reclaims the completely devastated, isolated valley. Cold white frost entirely consumes the violently splintered thick timber. The entirely brutal, completely lawless 1890s logging historical frontier absolutely holds the laws of completely terrifying, permanently buried dark secrets. Entire massive logging crews occasionally vanished without leaving a single trace of physical evidence. Stark historical records compiled by urban city officials would later entirely write off the absolute disappearance of 60 hardened loggers as simple winter madness. Arrogant bureaucrats safely located in warm, highly distant civilized archives actively blamed bad geographical placement and complete isolation from civilized law enforcement. Confidently categorizing the total absolute loss of the expensive timber operation as a tragedy of severe unpredictable weather closed the files permanently. They remained completely blind to the brutal, ancient, mathematical reality governing the deep wilderness. Sprawling breathing woods simply forcefully swallowed those who fatally forgot their rightful biological place in the ruthless food chain. Nature ruthlessly autocorrects any severe imbalance strictly within its territory.
When those high society city historians closed those frozen 1890s case files, they safely assumed the deep woods simply swallowed those men whole. They remained completely oblivious to the freezing mathematical sovereign currently ruling that black timber. But I want to know exactly what territory you are defending tonight. Drop your specific city or country down in the comments right now, and let me know exactly where you are watching this cold historical cover-up from. If you want to absolutely ensure the algorithm never writes you off as a casualty in the dark dirt, you must actively claim your permanent spot in the pack today. Hit that like button immediately. Share this deep winter freeze with a trusted friend. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell right now before the atmospheric pressure in your own room completely plummets.